Manoa mai te putanga o te ariki, manoa mai te putanga o te taura o te tauira. Ka eke rongo rupe, ka eke rangi tā hua hua. Tēnei te matakahi, tēnei a manga nui ki Tāmaki. Tēnei Ngāti, tēnei ngā tapu. Tēnei au ko hakatau pōtiki, te toa tā maua, runga o huaiki, te topa nei, te tiu nei, kei ngā taumata. Taumata o te reo, taumata o te mātau, taumata o te ora, ka putu ki te whaia, putu ki te amarama. Whāno hara mai te toki, haumi e hui e taiki e. This is a tauparapara. It is a Māori modality of connection. It connects me to an ancestry, to a landscape, an oceanscape, and a skyscape. It infuses the innate energy that underpins my character. It expands my mana, the mana to listen and the mana to be heard here in this space and time. I te tuatahi ake, e rere tonu ana ngā mihi e tuku nei au ki a rātou te kāhui titapu. Rātou kua riro ki te ierere o ranginui e tui honei. Kua riro anō hoki rā ki te kirima hewa hewa papatū anu koe takoto nei. Hoki wairu mai haere. Haere ki te putahi nui o rehua. Haere ki Hawaii ki nui, ki Hawaii ki roa, ki Hawaii ki tawhiti. Ki au te moe, ki tapu te moe ki a ngū, tō moe. I just want to acknowledge all of our ancestors, our friends, our family who have recently passed. We go there in a ceremonial context so that we can move us out of a state of normal and into a state of sacred. And to be sacred, we go for emotional capital. And so we call out to those who leave their memories behind for us, and we acknowledge them. We bring them here into this time, into this space. Ka hoki nei au ki te whaia, ki te amarama, te he mauri ora. And so I acknowledge those of us, the living, who have convened here into this digital space. I convene us on the sneeze of life. Tēnei ka mihi rā ki a koutou, MRCagney, koutou, te Pākihi nei, whakaritea, tō tātou kaupapa o te pō, o te ahi pō nei. He kaupapa e haumarutia te tai ao, e tātou, i te rā nei, mō ake tonu rā. Nō reira, ki a koutou, Bridget Paul, koutou, ngā mema o te Pākihi nei, tēnei e mihi kauatu ana ki a koutou. Ki a koutou hoki e ngā kai kōrero i te pō, tēnei e mihi kauatu ana ki a koutou. So I just want to acknowledge those who have organised our hui today so that we can move through the challenges that we have upon us and acknowledge MRCagney, who are experts in the movement of humans across space. And we use this moment to think about the contextualization of a future where we have a radiant environment, we have a radiant landscape, a radiant oceanscape, but also a very important radiant emotionscape. So thank you for the opportunity to share our heavenly culture here of Aotearoa with you. E aku nui, e aku rahi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. He aha te hau e wawara mai, he tiu he ra ki nāna ia mai te puputara ki hiki uta e tiki nā tu e au, te kotiu ko ia te pau whakairo ka tū ki wai te mata, I oku wairangi e kōkiri. On September the 23rd, we celebrated this heavenly song, which has been gifted to Ngāti Whātua, the local ancient brand of Tāmaki, over the last 500 years. It is our most ancient data sheet, and we use that data sheet today to create emotional inspiration so that we can achieve the things that we need to. Because when everyone is a guardian, no one needs to be. Tēnā koutou.
Kia ora and kia ora te aroha. Thank you so much for that mihi. Ko Ngāti Pakiha toku iwi no kirikiri roa ahau. Ko Doran toku whānau, ko Bridget Burdett toku ingoa. Welcome everybody to this event as part of the wonderfully framed Auckland Climate Festival. This festival is running now until the end of October, and you can all check it out at acf21.co.nz. There's a whole raft of other events that I'm sure you'd enjoy participating in. So we'd like to thank very much the organisers of that festival, particularly Six Generations Limited and all of the generous sponsors. As I've said, I'm Bridget Burdett, and I am a transport engineer and principal researcher at MRCagney, and we are a professional services consulting firm of around 25 staff across Waikato and Auckland, serving all of your level 3 lockdown sustainable transport needs at this time. We exist to do good, and we're excited to be here with you all today. We will be recording this event. We are recording this event, and we'll share it with all those who registered after it's finished. So today we are delighted to have Jenny Cooper as our keynote speaker, who's going to talk shortly about the need for climate leadership and her perspective from as a lawyer for climate action. We're going to have a group kōrero. We'd like to thank all of those of you who have supplied us questions in advance. We'll pose some of those throughout the discussion. You're welcome also to contribute to our chat if there's any other questions or comments that come to mind. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jenny to you all. So Jenny is a commercial litigator. She has specialist expertise in company and securities law, competition law, and insolvency. Jenny is one of New Zealand's top QCs in dispute resolution and a leading insolvency and restructuring barrister. Jenny is importantly also the inaugural president of Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand Incorporated, which brings together lawyers to advocate for action against climate change. So thank you very much, and over to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Bridget. Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko mongoika te monga, ko waitanata te moana, ko Pākehā te iwi, ko Jenny Cooper tōku ingoa. So good afternoon, everybody. As Bridget's just said, I'm president of Lawyers for Climate Action NZ, and it's a great honour to be kicking off this session this afternoon. The topic of climate leadership and the future of Tāmaki Makaurau is a pretty big one. So I need to start, I suppose, by disclaiming any particular expertise on the theory of leadership or local government or urban planning. I'm not really an expert on any of those things, I'm afraid. So what I'll do is I'll just talk a little bit about how I got involved in climate action, my thoughts about leadership, and then I will round out by making some comments about how I see the challenges currently facing Tāmaki Makaurau in this space. So I think Paul's in charge of the slides. Could I have the second slide, please? Great. So I just wanted to say a little bit about Lawyers for Climate Action, because that's really how I come to be involved in climate. So as Bridget was saying, I'm really a commercial lawyer. I'm a barrister. My background is not in environmental law at all, but together with a group of lawyers from all sorts of backgrounds, we really felt we wanted to contribute to climate action in some way. So we tried to think about how we could do that, and we wanted to do it in a way that was going to be most effective and make the best use of our particular skills and expertise. So that's why we decided to start Lawyers for Climate Action NZ. And we've now got around, and that was 2 years ago, and we've now got about 350 members, all lawyers, and around 60 associate members who are non-lawyers. And our focus is on, well, we started out with a focus on raising awareness of climate change and the threats and reality that we're facing. I'm happy to say that over the last 2 years, awareness has really increased a lot. So that's perhaps not quite as strong a focus of ours now as it was initially. And what we're really focused on primarily now is advocating for legislation and policies that will really cut our emissions, that will do the job for us, and that are adequately policed and enforced, because it's no good having rules if nobody's actually following them. And then we're also very keen to see that the way we go about tackling climate change preserves the values that we hold dear, which are the rule of law, the principles of Te Tiriti or Waitangi, New Zealand's international legal obligations, and in this space that's primarily the Paris Agreement, but also our other international commitments and human rights commitments in particular, and of course the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. So we're very much in favour of a just and equitable transition to a low carbon society. And the other big part of what we do, which we feel very strongly about, is trying to facilitate pro bono legal assistance to other groups who are working to fight climate change. And so that is what we're about. So I guess my thoughts on leadership, and I've got too many words on this slide, but I guess I wanted to try and capture some ideas. I think when we think about leadership, it's natural to think about charismatic leaders, the people who lead from the top and the front and set out a vision and bring other people on board to follow them towards that vision. And I do think we definitely need that kind of leadership. Climate change, like any big problem, requires collective action, and the only way you're going to get coordination of that collective action is with some top-down leadership. So that's definitely essential. But it is a very complex and multi-pronged issue, and there's not going to be a single leader or a single set of ideas that can provide us with everything we need to accomplish the breadth and scope of change we need. So we really do need leadership in a lot of different ways. I think we need leaders across all sectors, because there is no sector of our economy or our society that is not affected by climate change. And we need leadership at all different levels of decision making, because I think what we have seen to date in climate action is perhaps some very good, ambitious goals being set out, but those not then translating into action. And particularly in New Zealand, we've said a lot of good things, but we're yet to see any actual material effect on our emissions. They're still not really coming down. And the other aspect I think that's important to think about when we think about leadership is the need for social license and the democratic mandate for change. So we need to be talking to everybody, and we can't follow a particular model of change or a particular model of leadership that leaves significant sectors of our society outside of this mission. So we need to really bring everyone together. We need to have collaborative forms of leadership and approaches. We need to be tackling this really across the board. And I also feel we need some key things that I think are important for any leader to think about: consistency, fairness, and integrity, because you can't build trust and inspire people to take risks and change what they're doing and take actions that aren't comfortable and familiar to them unless you have that trust. And you only get that trust through being fair and through being consistent. And again, that's why I think perhaps we haven't seen as much progress as we would all like to see so far in achieving transition and tackling climate change, because there has, I think, been too much inconsistency and perhaps not enough trust in the vision and that things are actually going to change. And of course, on a similar vein, for any change to be enduring, it has to continue to have that support, it has to be inclusive, and it has to be focused on equity and social justice. So coming back, I suppose, to my own experience of Lawyers for Climate Action, I think for us it was about thinking how can we lead in a constructive and collaborative way that uses our skills and tries to fit in with what other groups are already doing. And so that's what we've really focused on trying to do. And we try to work collaboratively. We are part of the All Aboard Aotearoa coalition of groups, so which is focused on decarbonising Auckland transport. And so that's a umbrella organisation that Lawyers for Climate Action is part of, together with Greenpeace, Generation Zero, Bike Auckland, Movement, Women in Urbanism, and I'm worried I've forgotten someone. Anyway, I've lost count, but But that's been a fantastic process, I think, of bringing those groups together and finding a common set of values that we all want to work on, and a common goal, and using our different skill sets to try and achieve that. And I think that's really how we need to approach this. There's no single profession or single group of people that can solve climate change. We really do need the politicians and the scientists and the engineers and the lawyers and the doctors and really everybody from all walks of life to get involved, because it's going to require change and commitment by everybody. And I suppose, so I do see leadership and climate action as being a sort of a matter of personal responsibility, but I do also want to make it clear that I think climate change and the answer to climate change is very much a systemic issue that requires a systemic solution. But that's not to say that we can't still make a difference at the individual level, and it's only through that individual action that we can achieve the systemic change that we need. Now, I've talked a bit about leadership and the sort of moral imperative to leadership. There is also a legal imperative, I would say, for some organisations and governments in particular. And that's also where Lawyers for Climate Action comes in, is trying to call on the public decision makers to comply with their legal obligations in relation to climate change. So I think that brings me on to Tāmaki Makaurau. So if I could have the next slide, thanks. So I've just got here a picture which I've pulled out of the Auckland Council technical report on its greenhouse inventory to 2018, just to give a little bit of a snapshot of the challenge that Auckland faces in relation to its emissions. And really, probably I'm talking to an audience that already knows this far too well, but what's immediately obvious when we look at Auckland's emissions profile is that a huge proportion of it, just over 30%, that blue section at the bottom there, comes from cars and light commercial vehicles. And that's why in All Aboard, we're very focused on tackling those transport emissions, because it's such a large part of the issue here in Tāmaki Makaurau. Which is not to say that the other forms of emissions don't matter too, but really the cars and light vehicles is really the biggest issue we need to tackle. It's also worth noting, in terms of, I suppose, a different aspect of leadership, why Tāmaki Makaurau matters so much. And that's because it's obviously New Zealand's highest CO2 emitting region. Tāmaki Makaurau produces 34% of New Zealand's household emissions, which is not surprising. That's also the percentage of the population it makes up. But we're clearly not going to shift the dial nationally unless we can shift the dial here in Tāmaki Makaurau. The other challenge is that Auckland's gross greenhouse gas emissions have increased significantly. They've increased more than 30% since 1990 to 2018. So they're moving in the wrong direction. So that's another reason that's so critical that we really turn things around here. And we are, of course, expecting to have continued population increase. So that presents another challenge. And we've seen around the world the really important role that cities can play, and really some quite inspiring change that's been brought about by city governments. We've seen in Paris, for example, the amazing uptake in cycling. And so there's some really exciting innovations happening around the world that we can emulate, so that we can essentially, lead other urban areas in New Zealand by demonstrating what's possible. So we've gone to the next slide. And so what we have seen in Tāmaki Makaurau is, I think we've seen both extremes. There's almost a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type situation, where on the one hand we have sort of climate action, Tāmaki Makaurau, which has produced a wonderful climate plan, Te Taruki a Tāwhiri, which I think is a really tremendous piece of work. And I've set out there on the slide the core aspects of it. which I'll talk about more in a moment. But at the same time, we then have the sort of business as usual Tāmaki Makaurau, where it seems to be really difficult to actually get practical changes underway that are actually going to start bringing emissions down. And that juxtaposition, I think, is what we see when we compare Te Tārukia Tāwhiri with the Regional Land Transport Plan. These two documents really bear no relationship to each other. So if we look for a moment at Te Tārukia Tāwhiri, it's very much aligned with the Paris Agreement and the need to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. It sets a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Tāmaki Makaurau by 50% from 2016 levels by 2030. Now, as part of that, because we've seen already what a large proportion of our emissions come from transport, and then some of those other areas where emissions come from are really very hard to reduce. So hence the focus on transport for that initial period 2030, and the plan targets a 64% reduction in transport emissions. Meanwhile, the Regional Land Transport Plan, which was adopted just a few months ago, forecasts a 1% increase in emissions from transport by 2030. Although it is noted that once central government policies such as the fee bait for electric vehicles are taken into account, that's expected to go from a 1% increase to a 6% reduction. But it's obviously a very, very long way from the 64% reduction targeted by Te Tārukia Tāwhiri. So something has gone wrong there, and it doesn't quite all add up. And as many of you will know, All Aboard Aotearoa has filed a judicial review action challenging the Regional Land Transport Plan on the basis that we say it's not consistent with Auckland Transport and Auckland Council statutory obligations. So as I say, I think this is a really interesting sort of scenario to be thinking about in terms of climate leadership, because on the one hand, we have the vision, we have the goal, and we have the leadership of this is what we need to achieve, which is a great start set out into Te Tārukia Tāwhiri. And also, of course, Auckland Council has declared a climate emergency, and it is a signatory to the local government climate change declaration, and it's a member of the C40 cities group, which are sort of all indications of commitment and leadership. But then on the other hand, we see the enormous difficulty it appears to be having in translating that into a concrete plan and concrete spending through the Regional Land Transport Plan. And the difficulty with this, of course, is that because of the lack of consistency, there's a risk that people become cynical about the goals and disengaged, and it loses trust. And so I think this is really something that needs to be tackled if we're going to start to see real climate action in Tāmaki Makaurau. In the meantime, we are blessed to live in a city that has so many extremely hardworking and committed climate activists, and I think this festival is a real testament to that, and is tremendous, the number of people that are really working hard on these issues, and I'm blown away every day by the people I meet. So, and I do acknowledge as well, it's a very tough job to really transform a city in 10 years. So it's not surprising that there is resistance and there are step-backs, but that's precisely why we need leadership. And I'm really confident that through our collective leadership and our collective action, we can achieve this goal and make Tāmaki Makaurau the inclusive and thriving low-carbon city we know it can be. So I understand there are questions already. I'm very keen to hear from the other panelists. So I'm going to end it there and say thank you very much for listening. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou.
Kia ora, Jenny. Thank you very much. That was a brilliant insight, and I think there are perhaps some other people not present that would benefit from the recording of this presentation. We might take some opportunities to share it with them shortly. So now we're going to talk through some questions, and I'm going to therefore introduce our wonderful panel. So we have Dewey, Sacayan, Alec, Tang, and Te Aroha Grace back with us, who are going to firstly introduce themselves, and I'll let them do that shortly. And if you'd like to, panelists, perhaps put forward one hot topic about climate change that you'd like to get off your chest. Perhaps there's something Jenny said that resonated with you, or something that just swirls around your mind when it's wandering of a day. And so first, to introduce themselves, I'd like to invite Dewey, please.
Awesome. Well, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Ako si Dewey. Kia ora, ko Dewey toko ingoa, ko Manila me Tāmaki Makaurau aho. I moved to Aotearoa back in 2007. I went to Selwyn College, which is in the domain of Ngāti Whātua. And then I went to University of Auckland, where I studied law, politics, and economics. And so like Jenny, I am a lawyer by day and a climate activist by night. I am very passionate about climate justice, particularly for youth and migrant communities who have been displaced because of disasters. And the reason for that is because my climate activism journey started when I led a disaster relief program after Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines back in 2013. You know, I can delve and talk a lot about that experience, but it was basically an eye-opening experience that, that has changed my direction in life. And that direction is to focus on climate action. And after that, I've been very fortunate to develop my knowledge about climate change and about campaigning through the UN climate talks. One is about to happen in November, COP26. So I went to 2 of those while I was still studying at university. I also was very fortunate to be part of the Generation Zero team who lobbied for the Zero Carbon Act, lobbied big businesses in Aotearoa and grassroots campaigning to divest many organizations like the University of Auckland and the Vatican. And so we launched the Laudato Si Youth Manifesto. And alongside Jenny, we also launched a judicial review against Mill Road via All Aboard Aotearoa. Everything that Jenny said really resonated with me. I really agree with what she said, particularly when it came to that responsibility and doing as much as we can, because this is all our problem and we can all solve it together. But a hot topic for me, just to kind of, I guess, widen it a bit, is the notion that youth, especially Indigenous and people of color, they're often portrayed, or we are often portrayed as angry or overwhelmed by eco-emotions, and therefore sometimes we are sidelined in decision making. And consulting us is often seen as a box that need to be ticked. And honestly, like those stuff I've personally experienced in all levels at the UN, here in New Zealand, lobbying businesses, etc. And youth, particularly Indigenous and people of color, we have the most to lose because of climate change. So I think that our voices should be prioritized.
Wonderful, kia ora. Thank you, Dewey. Alec, would you like to introduce yourself?
Kia ora koutou, ko whakauraka mai, e mihi ana o kina mana whenua huri noa o Tāmaki Makaurau. Ko Bakko Ngau, toka maunia ko Sātau toka awa, ko Taiping Wan, toka moana ko Tang, toka iwi, ko Alec Tang, toka ingwa, no Gong Ha Tune Hern Gong, no Birmingham, England, no Onihanga Tāmaki Makaurau aho, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Dewey. Thanks, Te Aroha and Jenny. So those of you who don't know me, I'm currently the Director of Sustainability at Kāinga, but similar to Dewey, my history and relationship with sustainability and climate issues goes way back before that, and previously was at Auckland Council helping navigate through that Te Tarakia Tāwhiri development process. So look, I'm going to cheat and my 2 hot takes that I have. The first one just again resonates with Jenny and actually this platform and this climate festival. And I want to make a really massive shout out, not just to the climate festival team, but Michelle Kennedy, who sat me down for a coffee about a year ago and said, look, I've got this great idea. and here we are with 75 plus events, with almost 100 people on this webinar, all here to talk about climate action, climate leadership. And my first hot take is you're not alone. You know, there is a mass of people, a mass of interest from all kinds of different parts of society, from leaders with a capital AL to leaders across community. If you look at the agenda that's lined up, that has happened over the last week and a half, that's happening again for the next week, you know, there's action all around us. And often when we're thinking about climate change, we can be a little bit despondent and a little bit of, you know, it's not going anywhere, we're not achieving anything. But that momentum is really building. And I felt it at my time at council, and I'm feeling it here and in the work at Kāinga. So that's the first one, just to make sure that, you know, you look around and you find other people who are really pushing and really pushing hard. The second one that I want to raise is just a bit of a reflection on where we are right now, you know, locked in our bubbles, for those of you up in the Tāmaki, and some of the lessons that we're learning. And one of the big lessons that I think we can learn is the importance of that broad leadership. The fact that actually we will only see momentum if people hear this is what we need to do from people that they resonate with. And I think that's a really important thing that we're learning very quickly through this current phase of our COVID response, that community leadership is so critical. And also we're learning that if we don't have that, this issue around inequity, and that our response just really falls down really quickly if we don't think about those inequities that are around there, and that we need to consciously tackle those in our response is really important. So yeah, sorry, 2 hot takes, but really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have.
Oh, this is just so awesome. I think we might just book in everybody's next 7 hours and keep going till midnight. So Te Aroha, back to you.
Tēnā koe te whare. I acknowledge you, the house. We see each other and therefore bring each other into existence. As I said in my mihi, I come from Auckland tribally, culturally, emotionally, all the way to the tip of the island that we call North. So I'm a complete Northie boy. I guess in my journey of becoming now the market calls me a cultural practitioner. And what I found is that just my lifestyle of being a Māori is now marketable. And what does that mean? That means what happens to me, and if I compare it to my life when I was being an excellentist at being Pākehā, which I was, in that world, it taught me more about growth than guardianship. And so from Jenny's conversation, I wonder when the incentives of business will start incentivizing guardianship. This is a huge problem if we don't, because we know that incentive and punishment is what has moved humans across space and time. And I think what I see as a pattern that excites me about the hope of my future is that I see feminine energies moving into strategic roles. And I see with that feminine energy and also an increase in cultural empathy and empathy in general in business. And I think this is a pattern that's very exciting to see, but there are plenty of commentators out there that are very afraid of this. And, I guess my take from what Jenny said is 2 things. One from climate change, which is how do we get people to feel like they belong? Because as an Indigenous practitioner, people think I'm synonymous with belonging. People think I'm synonymous with diversity. They think I'm synonymous with sustainability. And they're actually right, because I have the emotional tools that have built me up so that I can look at a mountain and call it my grandfather. So this in a religious context was called something very scary. And so I wonder what that means in the future. How do we get people to feel like they belong? Because Māori can teach you some things. In terms of leadership, I'm really interested in how we move out of the idea that leadership is perceived as something that has to be visible, that has to be at the front, that has to be the most powerful, that has to have the strength. I think it's about who creates the most impacts. And the truth is, we don't actually have the metrics to measure the impacts that people have in our life. What we do is we give notice to those who sing the loudest, or we might make the most money. But if we think about those things, they teach us about growth rather than guardianship. So these are takes that I'm interested to have a conversation about. Tēnā koutou.
Tēnā koe, te aroha, thank you all. This is really great to start. And I wonder, on that note, Jenny, if you have any comment back to what Alec and Te Aroha and Dewey have said so far, as specific, you know, especially about this leadership question with climate change.
Well, I mean, I really agree with everything that everyone has said. So we can have one of those panels where everyone just violently agrees with each other. But look, I think there's a whole lot of really interesting comments in there to unpack. You know, I totally agree with Dewey that you know, the voice of youth and Indigenous peoples and people of colour need to be heard and not just treated as a box ticking exercise. They really do need to be at the centre, because, you know, part of, you know, we need to change the way society has been run, because that's how we've got ourselves into this position in the first place. And if we're not careful, you know, climate change is just going to exacerbate the sort of inequities that we already have, and further you know, further deprive Indigenous people of access to their resources and their land. So it really is super important. And I also think, share that sense of frustration that when you speak up and call for justice, it often gets sort of treated as sort of somehow inappropriately emotional. And, you know, I think that's appalling. I think emotion is absolutely called for. And is very much also what's appropriate and is inappropriate is very much in the eye of the beholder as well. And so I think we've got to be sort of open to those conversations and to hearing what people have to say, even though it might be uncomfortable. And then I really endorse what Alec was saying, that there's you know, for me, part of the joy of getting involved in climate action has been finding out how many people there are out there who really care and are really fighting and working hard to make the world a better place. And that is just such a wonderful thing to be part of. We are not alone, any of us, and it's just really inspiring, and that gives me a huge amount of hope. And it really does need to be across every level. You know, within organizations, it needs to be right through the organization, and everybody can lead in their own way. It's not all about being the person who gives the presentations or the interviews or sort of leads the marches. There's lots of different ways to lead, and on that I completely agree with what Te Aroha says as well, that it's not all visible. A lot of it is invisible, and a lot of the most powerful change happens quietly and behind the scenes. And then, sorry, I've turned this into a much longer comment than it should be. But the point about incentives for business is really important as well. And yeah, that's a tough one to change, because the culture of business is so deeply entrenched, and our law actually supports the sort of money-making focus of business, because that's what the purpose of a company almost is by definition, but that is starting to change as well. And there's a really interesting private members bill that's just been introduced, looking at changing directors' duties to make it clear that directors can have regard to environmental and wider concerns, and not just the interests of shareholders viewed in an economic sense. So I'm a big supporter of that.
That's really interesting, and that speaks to something specific that we can all do within our own sectors or communities or worldviews to drive that change, and perhaps celebrating that change and the wins, and even the festival and the fact that we are here is an important part of that impact that Te Aroha talks about, that it doesn't just have to be leadership and titles. We've got some specific questions about leadership that I will read out, and then I'll invite the panelists to give any comment or something that resonates with them from those questions. So the first is, how do we overcome institutional inertia to take strong climate change action? The second is, how do we get the public buy-in for the scale of change needed? And Jenny alluded to the fact that perhaps the public is past a tipping point and is quite aware of some of the scale of change. And what would be the most helpful regulatory change that would allow faster you know, climate change action? So Alec, Do you have any comment about any of those and with regard to leadership in this?
What potentially triggered that? The institutional inertia question, possibly. Hey, look, before we go there, I just want to make a comment on the back of Jenny and Dewey. I think actually the comment there around, and I don't think this is what you said, Jenny, but the comment around engaging with youth, I think it's not a should in terms of like we should do this. It's a we must, because actually what we see, or what I see in the conversations, I'm lucky because I get to lecture a whole bunch of really inquiring minds. And the last time Dewey and I were on a panel, we were at a UN Youth Summit where they're asking some great questions and unconstrained questions. Like, you know, we sit around and I'm seeing, like, you know, we ask questions of change and it's always like, oh, we can't, or we shouldn't, or we have tried that and it hasn't worked. And you don't get that, you know, you get the we must and we have to, and what if we try this, and what if, and I think that's why it's an importance there of bringing that unrestrained view in, and then that diversity of opinion as well, that's not being conformed by society. So I think I just wanted to throw that in because I think it's really important that we make that point. Just to comment on the institutional inertia, maybe. And I think, I mean, Jenny, you kind of flagged this, I think, in some of your comments about, you know, what I see as the challenges, generally speaking, in the organizations I've worked with, you have people who really want to do things differently, but there's a target or a metric or a number that's stopping that from happening. And it's really finding what those are and going, well, actually, no, that needs to change, because if that doesn't change, we're just going to toy around to the edges here, and we might find an intervention or whatnot, but then we'll just be brought back to this target. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've seen is making sure that we find those metrics or those targets that we're working to, bring some of that youth, like challenge that and go, well, why is it that, and why can't it be something else? And actually, if we actually want to do something really good, if it was this, we'd get a whole bunch more stuff and a whole bunch more benefit. And we look at the housing sector, so the work that we're doing now at Kāinga, you know, there's a massive opportunity to deliver a whole range of benefits, you know, climate benefits, transport emissions benefits, health benefits, community resilience benefits, all these things. But if we're going to deliver that, we need to just get away from we're just building lots and lots of houses to we're building really good houses in the right place that deliver on the needs of the people who actually are most vulnerable. So I think that for me is the institutional inertia bit, is that we have these settings, and it's kind of like any structure, any system. What are the settings that are driving those responses, those actions, and tackling that rather than trying to play around the edges and then fundamentally being brought back to that metric or that target.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So we're starting with a premise of we must now, not maybe, but actually this is something that needs to happen. Therefore, why not? And the why not is up to all of us in our own organisations and systems to go in and tease out the little barrier or process or tool or bit of paperwork that is stopping that energy from progressing through to action. Te Aroha, I might bring you in as well now and talking about perhaps some of those system level challenges. We had a question about what do you believe is the most effective leverage or intervention point to realise significant system change? And that builds perhaps on what we were talking about. What do you think, where is that undoing that we need to do to progress some of this mahi?
I think there needs to be a very clear way in which we can describe this truth without the truth being subjected to manipulation. I think if you think about the history of this problem, let's just go back to the 80s, If you think about people who lobby for businesses, how many of them lobbied for environmental thrivability? So none, basically. And so now we're starting to see businesses waking up to this dilemma, but they're still fighting existing lobbyists who want to maintain the current agenda, to sweat assets, to sweat the current agenda that they have so that they can capitalize on it. So I think we're thinking about the change of ideologies like capitalism, because capitalism, while I've become a successful capitalist in my history, but as I've become more and more of a practitioner, indigenous practitioner, I start seeing capitalism as a construct that gives me power and dominion over property, rather than the idea of belonging to the land or belonging to the ocean. So in Auckland, for example, there's 1 million people that tenant my city, and they all own their homes, but I belong to the land underneath them. And I will protect that land more than them, probably. And so what is the move to create this emotional outcome when business isn't very emotional? We've already spoken about the problems of emotional business. It gets pushed over into philanthropy corners, and that corner is, well, it's a really grim, small little corner. And so we're talking about really massive constructs that all need to adjust, all need to move. And to Alec's point, there are levers that we've seen for a long time, and now we're just starting to kind of tweak them. And I'll go back to my incentive analogy, which is, how do you incentivize businesses? I think the problem is that this idea that compliance is the incentive for people to behave, and in a Māori worldview, tikanga is the incentive for people to behave the right way. Tikanga means just to do the things you ought to do, not to get gross profits and to get, do you know what I mean? So I think New Zealand has the goods to be that emotional agenda. I think we have the right size petri dish. We've got heaps of evidence that we've leveraged things like Māori culture, for example, in ways that haven't really been potentiated. I mean, your #1 brand, it's famous for standing up and doing a haka in front of every one of its rugby games. And while we might lament that #1 brand losing a game, we can't imagine them not doing the haka. So not only does this haka infuse the observer with inspiration, but the team also get magic out of this too. So I'm just talking about a haka. This construct that looked like a performance is actually a lifestyle. That lifestyle can infuse you with emotion. It can make you a better practitioner of business. It can make you the entrepreneur of the future. Yeah, these are the things that I dream about.
Oh, that's awesome, Te Aroha, and it kind of builds on what I was saying about the festival and the vibe of this being an opportunity, and therefore embracing something that we're proud of and making it a good story and about what we can do and talking about that rather than the doom and gloom of what might happen if we don't. So, Dewey, I might bring you in there too.
I'm a proud Pākehā, Bridget, and people don't see that when they look at me, but I am. Yeah. I know 20 generations of my Irish ancestry, 17 generations of my Croatian ancestry. I'm a Westerner too. So I believe in this blended universe, but I think we're missing we need to be more like women. That's just my throwing it out there.
Kia ora. We'll write that one down. Dewey, have you got any thoughts about the system levers and what we can do there?
Sure. Well, first of all, I've been so inspired by everyone talking so far. But in terms of the systemic levers, and really the way I see it is that what are the levers that need to be pushed now to get us to 2030, where we need to have our emissions, right? So that we can actually keep our global temperature within 1.5 degrees. So I think holistically speaking, if we're looking at Tmaki Makaurau, those levers that we need to be really pushing and accelerating now would be adequate housing, public and active transport, proper water and waste management, sea level rise adaptation, but also socially equitable energy system transition, as well as a school curriculum that heavily focuses on climate change. And I think that achieving all of these is really crucial to future-proof Tmaki Makaurau. But it will take a lot of, I guess, behavioral shift in the community. And this is exactly what Te Aroha was saying, right? Like there's that cultural empathy that needs to be happening, but also that behavioral shift that we know can actually work. And that's how we got Zero Carbon Act passed. A lot of people believing that it's now time to change our mindset from is climate change real to how do we act on climate change now? And I think it really comes down to unity. You know, just like how we're tackling COVID-19 with a unified response of a team of 5 million, we need to make sure that no one gets left behind when it comes to transitioning Tmaki Makaurau to become a sustainable city. But also on top of that, I think that in terms of the levers that we need now to future-proof Tmaki Makaurau, another question that we should be asking on top of what are the levers are, who are the people who will actually accelerate those, right? Who are the people who are going to make those decisions for Tmaki Makaurau? Are they representative of the people of Tmaki Makaurau? Are they representative of iwi and Māori? Do they actually have the lived experience that a lot of people are living out now? So we do have that small window of opportunity. And as we prepare to get there, we cannot be just costs focused, and our decisions must be rooted in social justice and equity and decolonization. Otherwise, we're just going to be repeating the same problem again and again if we don't actually change our mindset towards, okay, how do we solve this in a decolonized way, in an equitable way, but also in one that's rooted in social justice. So I think the lack so far of that kind of behavioral shift in decision making is really what pushed young people like myself to, I guess, march on the streets. But also it's pushed us to lobby directly MPs for climate laws, to lobby businesses so that they could actually, I guess, stop that institutional inertia that we were talking about earlier and just get it done or get it started. But also we've got campaigns such as Make It 16 that really push the agenda of young people having a seat in the decision-making table, or at least being represented, so that they could choose who they want to represent them. And so I think that those system levers are really important, but we need to be more holistic and more imaginative when it comes to solving that. And it really must include who are those people who will get us there.
Wonderful. And, perhaps the greatest system lever of all is to change the paradigm, right? And so we're all here, and I think celebrating our successes along the way is super important to give energy to all of you and all of the people out there doing the good work. Jenny, I might bring it back to you. We've had quite a specific question, and it aligns with system levers, but in terms of law, what legal tools, this is a question that we had earlier, what legal tools are available to force the climate issue that could mandate Auckland Transport and Auckland Council to implement initiatives? And a very even more specific question, how likely is the legal review going on? How likely is it to get Auckland Council to meet its 64% reduction in transport emissions? How likely is it that legal challenge would be successful? And if it's successful, will they need to chuck their 10-year plan in the bin and start again? Like, where are we at with the power of legal tools at this point?
Right. Oh, that's a big question. So I'll start with the general. We are, thanks to the hard work by Generation Zero and others who got the Zero Carbon Act passed, we're actually in a really good position in terms of legal tools. So the wonderful thing is we do now have an act that makes the Paris targets part of our domestic law. And so we do actually have those tools now that we can start to hold government to account if they're not making decisions that are consistent with the Act. In terms of Auckland Transport and Auckland Council, I mean, they have their own legal obligations as well. When they're exercising powers under a statute, well, for the council, it's subject to the Local Government Act. And the Local Government Auckland Council Act as well. And that sets out specific statutory obligations that the council has to comply with essentially at all times. And one of those is it has to act, I'm struggling to remember the exact words, but it needs to take into account the environmental well-being of the current and future population of Tāmaki Makaurau. So it can't sacrifice the well-being of future Auckland residents for the convenience of current Auckland residents is what certainly that's how we would interpret that obligation in any case. And then under the Land Transport Management Act, that sets out specific requirements that regional land transport plans have to comply with. And one of those is being consistent with the government policy statement on transport. Sorry, this is all getting a bit long-winded, but the government policy statement on transport does talk about decarbonising transport. So essentially, there's sort of a network, a web of legal obligations that all of these decisions get made within, and increasingly those networks of obligations include climate change obligations and responsibilities. And so we're in a much stronger position than when we were previously in terms of trying to use legal tools. And so for most public decision makers, the obvious legal tool to use is judicial review to force them to, well, where they haven't complied with their statutory obligations, then the court can tell them essentially to go away and redo the particular decision. And so the objective of the all aboard judicial review of the regional land transport policy is to have it set aside and a new policy put in its place. And obviously all aboard thinks there's a good basis for the claim, or it wouldn't have been brought, but it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment further than that, really. Well, it'll be up to the court ultimately, so we'll just have to wait and see.
All right, can I just jump in a little bit, given we're talking a little bit about council? Can't help myself. But I think one of the key things as well, and obviously the judicial review and the challenge is really important. I think the other thing that's really important to remember is around that table there are 20 councillors plus the mayor, and these are individuals who are genuinely trying to do what they think's right for their communities, and this is what they're hearing in the conversations that they're having on the streets and whatnot. And so this goes back to one of the earlier points about each and every one of us can and should and will have an impact by having those conversations with your elected members, with your local council, with your local board members, to demonstrate that actually the view that they think is the community actually isn't the view of the community, and that there are a broader range of people who think actually no, these targets that we set are critical. We've got to do that. That is our priority, and we need to get that message across so that that when the decisions are being made, actually we're going to push hard here, because I've heard this around me, and I think that goes back to Dewey's point as well, that we need lots of voices from lots of different places as well, because you can imagine around that table there are some real concerns about transport equity and what does that mean and how we're going to resolve that, and not everyone can afford an electric vehicle and all those kind of questions, and we need people in those situations to stand up and go, look, yes, it's going to be challenging, but this is what we see as really important, and this is our perspective that actually we'll find a way, or this is the support that we need, and this is how we're going to make it. But we're really keen to make that transition. Here are some of those challenges that we talked about earlier, but we do want to make that change. And I think that's a bit that we can all do. Jenny and Dewey, you're going to go out there and you're going to test that legal perspective. We need to test the governance perspective and the leadership of our politicians to really make those changes as well.
I'll just quickly respond to that. I completely agree with you, Alec, and I do want to make it clear, certainly litigation should be an absolute last resort. I mean, it's far, far better not to have to go down that path. We'd much rather see the right decisions made in the first place, and we certainly did engage to try to encourage that. But I think you're absolutely right. It's about, we all have a responsibility to provide the support for these decisions, because it is incredibly difficult for the decision makers to go against the status quo, and there's certainly plenty of people telling them that they shouldn't. And we all know that changing something is harder and riskier than leaving it the way it is. So we all need to voice our support for that change.
Te Aroha, do you have any comment about this in legal tools as a system lever?
I think in a blended universe for Māori, for example, we're constantly living a bicultural universe. We are first biculturalists, and there's not many other practitioners who aren't Māori who are biculturalists. So we probably have the weapons of history and the weapons of the future because we've been raised in them. I think you could just look across the ditch at Australia. There's a society there that's been around for 60,000 years. They know and have experienced climate changes in their memory. But it just seems audacious that the domination complex of business has too big an ego to go and ask them. And I think this is just me fronting a conversation around why aren't businesses engaging people who might already have the insight, people who might already have the knowledge systems that have dealt with this before. I think you're seeing a war between what is practical science and what is ancient observable science. And ancient observable science is just as important as practical science. So it just so happens that ancient science also brings emotional tools with it, which I don't think science has. Science tries to convince you of an emotional outcome, but the science process doesn't show us any emotion. And so I think this blended universe is the universe I'm excited about, because Indigenous economies, Indigenous thought forms, Indigenous frameworks are right under your nose. It's right under everyone's nose. But I just fear that the domination complex, the complex of colonization, the business competition complex, I need to be richer than everybody else complex, we're up against some really powerful forces, and I can only see emotion getting us through that. And right now we're talking about legislation. Legislation is only emotional for the very powerful who have to compromise their profits. That's what legislation is for. Legislation doesn't kind of tell me that I should, keep from littering. It doesn't tell me that. I just do that because I feel I have a sense of belonging. And so I'm talking about something that's a bit deeper, that, as a blended university, even woman, here's a dominated culture that probably has the solutions in it, but for probably 10,000 years, it's been largely ignored by what has largely been patriarchal society. So I come from another complex, which is a matriarchal society, and I've seen the benefits of my patriarchal and matriarchal society, but I just look biased because I look like a Maori, but I know some incredible Western practitioners who are Pākehā, who have learned this modality of Maori, and they look like they have superpowers. So why doesn't everyone learn Maori?
Well, so say we went out to 2050 and we've got a beautiful blended survivable planet future, and you rewind back to now in the 2020s, what do you think our path would have been to that if we imagine in the festival optimism context and do an analysis now of how we get to the great and the good future, that we were all happy and thriving together? What do you think are some of the steps that need to happen, Te Aroha, to write that story?
I think multilingualism is clearly important. It doesn't have to be an Indigenous language. It just has to be multiple languages. We know that something happens to an intellect when a human discovers, has more than one language. There's an increase in empathy. There's all these things that we know. So I'm excited about a future where, for Māori, for example, there'll be a bunch of children who are going to walk out in the world and they can all speak Māori, whether they're Chinese, Indian, doesn't matter. But I'm going to lament the trauma of those Māori who can't speak their language at that time, who are facing this dilemma of, they're going through a different kind of world plan and still unable to access their self-love content. So while I think the self-love content of Māori is good for all of us, there's a dilemma for those who are Māori who are still having problems accessing their own content. This is a dual sword scenario that us as an iwi even think about. We're constantly, everyone thinks that iwi all move together. No, we have people who have very far right-wing ideas and people who are far left and everything in between. How do you keep people with that diversity in cultures together? Well, we do, and we still show love for each other. And, maybe this diversity that we have amongst ourselves can be taught out there.
Can I just jump? Te Aroha's comment around emotional response, I think, is so bang on for the change that we need to see. Because I think, I can't remember, Bridget, I think it was you who acknowledged, change is scary, change is hard, change is different. And what we need is we need people to push past that fear and find that emotional attachment and joy. Because what we're talking about, those transformations in our transport system, we know if you push through that, it's different, it's difficult, but actually it's, you have more time, you're not stuck in a car, you have a whole bunch of positive emotions that come out of it. If we have neighborhoods where we're actually talking more to each other, have time to talk to each other, there's a positivity, but often you get prevented from doing that first step because of that fear. But you have to go through that to actually experience that emotional connection. And I think that's something that we kind of shy away from and don't really push hard enough to get to that point, to get to that actually, this new way of doing something is actually positive. And it's really weird, I find, that with COVID, the response to COVID, or that the outcome of COVID, or that the answer to COVID is like a mask and immunizations, it's all negative, yet we've moved. The opportunity for climate is all positive, and we're seeing an inertia to push through. So I think there's a really interesting kind of lots of lessons. I think, Dewey, you were talking about, the lessons we can learn from our current situation and how that can be applied to how we maybe reframe things a little bit, maybe move more to that, what's the future actually looking like and how do we get there?
Yeah, I was actually going to share when I was preparing for this, one of the key, I guess, like mantras in my journal that I wrote beforehand is a philosophy of Ubuntu. Not so sure if some of you guys have heard of that, but it says, I am who I am because of who we all are. And I think as a first step, we need to be looking at our humanity and our, you know, like we're all brothers and sisters in this race, which is humanity. And that in itself is, I guess, the first step in terms of seeing that, look, we are all in this, we're all on the, yeah, we're probably not on the same boat because some are in yachts, whereas some are in, you know, like dinghies and stuff, but we're all in the same storm, right? We're all in the same storm and we're all working towards solving one problem, and that is survival. That is survival, not just of those who are rich, who can afford to transition towards a sustainable type of living. We need to be doing that for everyone. And if we all understand that we are all humans and really dig deep in terms of our personal responsibility, that what Jenny was saying, but also that personal leadership of I can do something about this and I can do something for my community about this. How do I share it so that other communities can work together to do this? And I think that as a skill, the power of storytelling is really, I guess, important to note here, because, you know, we heard about using law, we heard about using governance, we heard about cultural empathy and multiculturalism as well. But I think that storytelling is super important as a skill, particularly for young people like myself who want to actually make a first step in trying to solve climate change and, I guess, adding to the future of Tmaki Makaurau. How do you actually enhance your storytelling so that when you speak to an MP or a local councillor or to Mayor Phil Goff about what you're scared about or what you are worried about in terms of your future, that you're persuasive enough to actually get there and to get that message across? How do you do that storytelling with your whānau? How do you do that to your, I don't know, climate denier uncle or your friends who may care about or may know climate change but really do not care about it? And I think that's where that personal leadership come in as well, right? Like, what are the skills that we need, and how do we actually enhance those so that we could do it and add to our humanity? And I think we can kind of go on and on and on about like different levers that we can kind of push and accelerate to get to that, to get to the future that we need to get to for Tmaki Makaurau. And you know, it's going to take all of us to get there. You know, myself and Jenny are lawyers who are obviously, like, we both agree that litigation is the last resort, but it is important because that incentive itself of you are going to get sued if you don't do this is real. That I guess, like, for me, in terms of that humanity, whenever I look at I guess mothers or mothers who care so much about or who sacrifice a lot, I think about, okay, what would they want for their kids? I don't have kids of my own, but I'm probably one of those people who they're still taking care of. So how do I actually want to, I guess, position myself so that I could help them take care of their community? But also, I think it's really important as well to think about those who aren't actually able to belong in society. There's a lot of, say, migrant communities who, you know, come from places who are literally at the forefront of climate change, right? I look at the Philippines, I look at my family in the Philippines who go through 26 typhoons a year. What can I do for them? How can I, as someone who's in Aotearoa, do something for those people, for my family back home? Like, and I think that's where we have to go. We've got to take a step back and think. It's actually all about just being humane, right? When we go to businesses and lobby them, it's really the ask is, let's be humane. So that's really something that I think I really got from all of you guys, from what you were saying. And there's a lot of action points there for someone like myself, who's a young climate campaigner, who goes out there and actually asks these questions from MPs, from local government, you know, from businesses, right? And that ask is, let's be humane.
That's really interesting, and I think there's a connection here between storytelling and our humanity, and what you were saying earlier, Jenny, about this climate change being a personal issue but also a system issue, and all of us have personal lives and probably hypocrisies and things in terms of how we live our lives and the stories that we tell ourselves and others who are close to us personally. But we also have our working life, and then us here, often we have professional hats in organisations that are involved in. I wonder, Jenny, if you've got examples of people whose minds have been changed, or perhaps yourself, where you've seen people get over a hurdle and therefore you can see the change happening at either an individual or an organisational level in your work, or perhaps a professional body or at a system kind of level. How do you think that humanity comes through in terms of making change at different levels?
I think, I do feel strongly that that emotional connection is a really important part of it, and I agree that storytelling is incredibly important. I suppose a counterexample that I always think of, which isn't quite answering your question, Bridget, but I'll mention this anyway, is how successful marketing of SUV cars has been.
Oh God.
That's driven completely by a story about connection with landscape, connection with freedom, and connection with some kind of sense of personal empowerment that's totally mythological, completely bogus, but it's been incredibly effective. And so we need to be telling different stories to ourselves about how to fill those needs. And I don't know how we overcome the huge marketing budgets of the car companies, but yeah, maybe we can't. But I guess it does demonstrate to me that really emotion is such a big driver of our decisions. And I guess coming back to what you actually asked me about, I've seen a real transformation, I think, in the conversation generally amongst my legal colleagues. And I don't know what that is attributed to, but only a few years ago, it was very difficult to talk about climate change, and people would sort of look really uncomfortable if you brought it up. And there were definitely a few people who would shut you down and who were clearly skeptics and told you you're talking nonsense. And I don't think that was the majority, but there were enough of them, and they were vocal enough that they made everybody else nervous. And then over time, that has really changed. And it's partly, I think, leadership of a few people who have been brave enough to stand up and speak out about it. And not me, there were plenty of people before me. But I guess probably the existence of Lawyers for Climate Action has probably helped encourage that process along. And now it is very different, and now I think it's completely the opposite. And also it's a change that's been happening around the whole world at the same time, where the evidence has become so overwhelming. And there's been people like MRCagney, I would say the previous chairman of the Bank of England. I think there was a huge shift in momentum when MRCagney spoke about the realities of climate change a few years ago. And he sort of gave permission to all the people who, you know, the very conservative business types to start being serious about it. And I think that was absolutely massive. So that's a good example, I think, of leadership that really matters. He gave a speech and overnight the conversation changed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And it just reminded me what you were saying about how conversations that used to be awkward and perhaps taboo become more mainstream. And I reflect then on Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori and the fact that I can pronounce taupo now. And when I grew up, I didn't call it that. How do you think, Te Aroha, what you were saying about language and identity and connecting with people, connecting between Māori and Pākehā, specifically in New Zealand, is that a really powerful way to progress climate change goals, even though on the surface it may not look like it?
I think if you have problems with loving yourself, you're going to have problems loving the climate. And I think that, for example, Māori have an epidemic of not loving themselves. We have the largest suicidal stats, all of those things. So you're totally talking up the right tree. I think let's have a look at tonight. There was a bunch of people that gave their pepeha. In fact, I would say probably my sense is 100%, but I'll be conservative and say about 95% of the people that I know practice their pepeha and even enjoy doing it. Every single one of them fight for the climate. So what is that data point? What has the pepeha done to people who did it firstly as a working thing? They did it for work, or they did it because we just need to be a bit more diverse. But as they practice this modality and they get more cultural, you know, more invested, then suddenly they become defenders of climate. So my point is, anyone who has self-love content, and that self-love content might not be, you might say be a Māori, but your self-love content might be in Greek mythology, because that's where mine was. I didn't have any Māori content when I was a kid, but I found my self-love content in the Greek mythology matrix. And it just so happened that corresponded with my Māori mythology matrix. Okay? So I think culture is a gem, but your own culture it stares you in the face every day. So there's going to be some trauma if you can't enable some of the things that you would expect you can practice as someone who belongs to a certain kind of culture. So I'm talking about dominated cultures in general. We've got a lot of people out there who don't love themselves, and if we got them into loving themselves, we'd automatically have people who love the climate, love to deal with climate change. That's not something a business can even research. This is just someone with some indigenous sense giving you what I see works inside my family, inside people who are trying to practice pepeha. I mean, do you know what I mean? Here's an emotional tool. I told you about a haka before. We could sing songs. Songs are emotional. I mean, how many people stop at a ceremonial moment before games and sing their national anthems? They all shut their mouths. Something compels them into this moment. And so what do we do at scale to engineer these kinds of moments? And that's something, I mean, I'm looking at social media. It's doing a massive stuff at scale, but I'm also worried because that social media says that it's looking for engagement, but it's actually hate dressed up as engagement. And so that's a problem for climate change, I think. Although I do see discussions about climate change there as well. So, you know, it's about belonging. It's about the idea of belonging. I've met so many Pākehā who tell me that they just don't have spiritual bones in their body or something like that. It comes up in that kind of conversation. I kind of look at them and go, well, did you sing the national anthem? Did you? And I remind them of ceremonies they even have in their life to actually prove, no, you are spiritual, but you're arguing a point about the domination complex, which is a whole another story.
Oh, that's beautiful. I think part of what you're saying resonated with me in terms of a pepeha kind of gives you permission to say what you want to say and to have a bit of a voice and authenticity. I wonder, Alec, if you've got any comment about that in terms of perhaps uncovering what people actually do want to say, and they maybe have been silent on issues like climate change, but giving people their voice and that self-love helps bring it out of them, perhaps.
Look, I think this is really, you know, it's great, and you know, funnily enough, one of the first pieces of work that I was involved with at Auckland Council was the Auckland Plan 2050, and those of you who know it, there are 6 outcomes, and actually the one outcome that always resonated most with me, and the one that I always thought we need to really fight for, is the belonging and participation outcome, which effectively says we won't have a thriving, cohesive city if people don't feel a sense of belonging to this place in some way. We don't have to define what that sense of belonging is. It could be the physical place, it could be the people, the work, whatever. But without that sense of belonging, then this fabric that we have just wilts and fades away. And then to reinforce that is a sense of participation in the governance of the city. So you're involved, you have a say, you're doing stuff. So I think, you know, fundamentally that, and you can have all this physical stuff about what a city is, but without that emotional connection, then it just starts to fall away. So I totally agree with that. I think that's such a really nice reflection. To your question, Bridget, about having a voice, and there's a similar but different anecdote where you can imagine I get asked to present in a whole bunch of different forums I used to. There was one which was a particular demographic, and I was a little bit worried about going, and you know, you can imagine what kind of demographic. And anyway, I went and I presented, and I got what you would expect to, you know, people listened, which was great, but some of the questions were in that kind of denial, we shouldn't, we can't, we won't questions, and those are the first questions that came up. But then afterwards, when the crowd dissipated, some other people from the audience just came up afterwards and had the, oh yeah, no, actually I really liked what you said and I really agree. And it's kind of like to Jenny's point, to have we still have that. This was only a couple of years ago, maybe like, oh, I don't think that this is the prevailing view of the people in the room, so I'm not going to say it. Whereas actually it could well be, and it really does need someone to stand up and go, actually, no, I I have a different view, and then others see that there is a different view and that that's not the prevailing view, or that's not everyone, and then you can have a discussion. And I think that's a really important break, and I think it goes to, Jenny, your points that you've made before about you don't need everyone completely bought in to start the momentum rolling. You actually need those few, and this is where this conversation about leadership, you know, your leadership maybe just to stand up around the family table and go, actually, no, I don't agree with that. And you don't have to kind of convince the other person, but at least saying that, no, I don't agree with that, or there is another perspective, there is a different way of looking at this. And I think, Jenny, your comment about, I mean, in one of the papers that we do at AUT, we talk about materialism, we talk about well-being, we talk about actually what does success look like. You know, even at a young age, even as, you know, university students, you have this picture of what success looks like that's been imprinted by those car ads that says success is a lovely car with a house and 2.4 children, and that's what you should be aspiring to. And we need to challenge that, and we need to go, that's not what defines success for me. Actually, something else defines success, and I'm happy with that, and there are others that are happy with that as well. So I think that point about, you know, standing up and just expressing that this isn't what I think, you know, or that isn't my view, I actually have a different view, is so important to moving us along.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it speaks a little bit to this issue of equity that we've touched on a couple of times. I wonder, Dewey, if you've got some thoughts about how we promote the voices of people who are the most quiet at the moment. There was a specific question earlier about how do you think we should be preemptive about the inequitable impacts of climate change? I wonder if that is to do with finding and amplifying people's voices, marginalised people's voices.
I think firstly, it has to be the first step in terms of looking at what the inequities are finding them and really identifying them. And sometimes you don't see that unless you actually talk to those people, unless you open your ears and, you know, talk to them one by one, or sorry, one-on-one. And this is kind of my problem beforehand that I was alluding to, right? Like my hot topic of the lack of consultation, because often the people who are marginalized the most are the ones who are actually not consulted on. And we've seen this happen quite a lot, particularly when it came to, I guess, the early stages of laws around climate. When we were starting off with the Zero Carbon Act, no one was listening. So no one was consulting the young people about what we wanted and what we really needed. And there's lots of inequities around Auckland, right? Like one of the biggest ones that I can see now is the fact that, you know, young people like myself who, who do not have any choice but to, I guess, rent out houses that are not, that are inadequate in terms of insulation. We are subjected to paying a lot in terms of our power. But also on top of that, some of us are also pushed all the way to the far fringes of Tāmaki Makaurau, which is very far away from where we need to be studying or working. Again, like that inequity then adds to the fact that we have to pay more to actually travel, or some of the people in our community must actually drive to get to places, and because of the fact that they live in low socioeconomic areas, they can't afford EVs or not yet. And so those are some of the inequities that we don't see unless we actually put ourselves in other people's shoes. And I guess in the high seats of people who make those decisions, it's really being able to get there and go out there and see that for themselves, but also talk to those people themselves. And so I think as a first step, I would say that like we need to do better as a community in terms of how we consult. That's number one.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and identifying them.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So time has swiftly moved on, and we are getting towards the end of this session. So I'd like to give you all 60 seconds, and I know some of you are better than others at knowing what 60 seconds is, so I might cut you off if you go a little bit too far, but perhaps Te Aroha, could you start us off with your 1 minute, what would you like to give to our audience in terms of a takeaway from this kōrero? You're muted, I think. We can't hear you. I'll let you start again.
Sorry, my context was all about emotion, because emotion is the thing that's going to drive anything. And incentives, etc., they're just going to coat the emotional side. So the emotional thing that turns me on the most is personification. It's an ancient human modality of creating things, reverent things. So if I look at my mountain, I call him my grandfather. That means I'm going to protect the hell out of him. Same with the ocean. So these are the modalities I think we should share. Personification is such a powerful tool. If you go to the Marvel movies, those are personification. I mean, Thor's 3,000 years old. Now he's the god of heroism rather than thunder. It just proves to you that it's intergenerational, lasts forever. Thank you, everyone.
Kia ora. Alec, what have you got to say?
I mean, I just can't get away from the emotional comment that Tiara has shared. That's really resonated for me about, you know, how do we make that connection? How do we get people to move beyond this thing over here that's important, but yeah, I'm not really connected. How do we bring it to people? How do we do that? And I think, you know, one of the things is it's going to be different for everyone. You know, there's different ways of doing that, and there will be different voices that will make that connection. I think, you know, the Super Saturday on Saturday, you know, that was classic of we hadn't adequately gone, who are the right voices to send this message? Where are the right places, to Dewey's point, to have those conversations? And I think we need to think a lot harder about that and how we do that. Otherwise, we're going to end up where we are, where you've got a very privileged group that are, you know, okay, and a lot of people who are left behind, because that's actually the direction we're going right now. So emotion and who we're trying to find to make that connection.
Great proactive efforts there. Yeah, Dewey, what do you think you'd like to say to the audience?
Sure. I guess my key message is that we have a short window of opportunity where we must all look to our strengths and our sense of humanity to act on climate change. We are all agents of change. We can all take direct action. And if you are a young person who is asking, how do I start? Start with storytelling, right? Start with loving yourself, and then go and practice that by directly going to those in the seats of decision making, and practice that storytelling with your family, right? Let's all take that direct action, because we can do it and we must do it now.
Beautiful. This is so great. I love your all timekeeping. So Jenny, we come back to you then. What do you think perhaps has surprised you or delighted you about this conversation or inspired you? What would you like us to reflect on tonight and into the future?
Well, for me, it's all been really inspiring. I think the key takeaway for me is the importance of both thinking in an empathetic way and thinking collectively, but also acting individually. So I think it's really on us all to think about, what do we want to contribute? What do we, in 10, 20 or 30 years time, when we look back on this critical period, what do we want to look back and see as being our contribution? Because we all have a contribution to make. And I think we all need to look within ourselves at our values and what actually is important to us, and live in a way that's true to that. And so I just really urge everybody to get involved. Do what we all need to do, what we can. It's so important.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. I'd like to now formally thank all of our panelists, Alec, Te Aroha, Dewey, and Jenny especially, for just wonderful, authentic contributions today. Thank you too to our lovely engaged attendees, including those who are watching this online. I invite you all to track down these panelists on LinkedIn or whatever forum you can find them on, to stay connected, because, you know, it is the enthusiastic ones who will change the world. It's the only group who ever has. We'd like to also thank particularly the Auckland Climate Festival for everything that they're doing, and for allowing us this opportunity to come together and to all be energised. Thank you very much, particularly Michelle Kennedy and all of the festival sponsors. We invite you again to check out what else is coming up in the festival at acf21.co.nz. A reminder that we'll be sending out the link to this recording. You can all watch it every night and continue that inspiration. If you'd like to stay up to date with what else is happening in climate change, as I said, connect with us all, connect with each other. You're welcome to follow MRCagney on LinkedIn as well. There's lots of hot chat that goes on down there, I assure you. So thank you again, everybody. It's been a wonderful forum, a pleasure to be here with you. Pō Mārie, and good evening.
Ko Mari.
Salamat.